Bill Henshaw here again for the Constitutional Crisis Channel. Another one of my, what you might call pet peeve type videos here, but we're going to be discussing what I call war and conspiracy, pattern and practice of the New York Banksters. Now, if you study the history of our involvement in wars, or some might say quote-unquote wars in certain instances, it gets interesting really early. And this goes back to as far as the war, the Mexican War in 1846. And it looks like, and this is the one I'm least clear about to be sure, but it looks like that the Americans managed to goad the Mexicans into making advances into the Republic of Texas, which technically at the time was their property and didn't want to be their property anymore, and beginning the onset of hostilities, which in turn resulted in the Mexican War of 1846 and the acquisition of a lot of property as a result of this war, including the annexation of Texas, the California property, and up as far as Oregon and Washington. I mean, we got a lot of property out of this in just a couple of years' war. It wasn't even close. I mean, we were the power even then. We were the 800-pound gorilla. Now, the war between the states in the 1860s, and this is supported by no less of an authority than Doris Kearns Goodwin. Not one of my favorite people, but a recognized historian who wrote a book called Team of Rivals. And in there, you'll read, I don't have the page number right now, but I'll get it for you in the comments below. You want to check this one out. That, the people around Lincoln that were advising him tried to arrange things, and they did so successfully to make it appear like the Confederates had fired the first shots at Fort Sumter. Now, they did, but they had been goaded into doing it in order, again, to open up the hostilities and begin the war. And we all know very well from history, or should know even from our history classes in the mandatory public education system, the result of that war. Well, see, all the southern states wanted to do was secede and be left alone, and they should have been able to do that. In another video, you're going to hear a lot more about that, but as far as I'm personally concerned, it was the northern states that breached the agreement. And when they did that, there was no agreement left to secede from. 1898, the Spanish-American War. And the big catchphrase there was, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, because of the sinking of the battleship Maine in the Havana Harbor. Well, it turns out, and I think the powers that be knew this at the time, but certainly it was well known later in history, that the Maine imploded. It wasn't sunk by the Spanish. We probably did it ourselves. But it came from inside, nevertheless. And as a result of this particular war, this was the onset of what you might call American imperialism, because of all the property we gained, including Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines. I mean, it just stretched the empire in a manner unbelievable to the framers of the Constitution. They wouldn't have been prepared for this at all. And the American people weren't either. And this war gave rise to what we're going to discuss in another video called the Insular Cases. And there's 4 or 5 of those in particular that go from about 1900 up to 1921. And you're going to see some striking similarities to American law these days when we go over these insular cases, where the Supreme Court held in effect that these people in these territories didn't have any rights. See you later. No right to trial by jury, no right to common law, nothing. Can't vote for president. Don't have any senators. You have one representative, non-voting, that you can vote for to represent you in Congress. I mean, there's a lot of crap that went on here with this stuff. But anyway, that's another war we got into under false pretenses, pattern and practice. And we get up to 1915, the sinking of the Lusitania, 100 years ago, I believe, this past July. Big deal, because the Lusitania was ostensibly one of those pleasure craft that you go on and have a good time, and this, that, and the other, and you gamble and whatever you do. Well, the real story behind it was that the Lusitania was a warship. And they had lots of munitions below and out of sight where nobody saw them, nobody knew they were there except for the ones doing the shipping. Now, the German government, to their credit, and this is 1915, so World War I has already begun. And they contacted the Americans and President Wilson and Secretary of State and attempted to put advertisements in the newspaper in order to warn Americans, do not get on the Lusitania. It's a warship. They were prohibited from doing it except for one paper, as I mentioned, I think, in an earlier video. This was the Dubuque Register in Dubuque, Iowa. Now, you tell me how anybody in New York City is going to be able to get a hold of that newspaper. And I've got pictures of the ad, too, in another book I have, about which more later. But here again, that's the ostensible reason why the Americans ended up entering the war, although in 1916, Wilson ran on the platform, he kept us out of war. He sure as hell did up until March 4th, 1917, when he was inaugurated for his second term. Less than 2 weeks later, we're in the war. I mean, you tell me, and under false pretenses, yet again. I mean, Lusitania was a warship. When the Germans hit that, it went up like a firecracker because they happened to hit all the munitions underneath it, and it sank quickly. And not only that, the Lusitania was ordered by Sir Winston Churchill, another infamous historical bastard, to shut down one of its boilers to slow it down. And the escort service for the Lusitania was called off by Churchill, making it literally a sitting duck, albeit in a big pond. But the Germans had no problem with it, and, you know, getting all this done. And it looks like to me there may have been a conspiracy between Churchill and the Germans, for all we know. In any event, we do get into the war on this basis, and against the interest and the wishes of the American people at the time. World War II, here we go again. The bombing at Pearl Harbor. You know, Roosevelt knew, or damn well should have known, that this was coming. His advisors did. They had broken the Japanese code and were aware of the situation. And this, for me, brings up an interesting movie I mentioned before called The Court Martial of Billy Mitchell. And that was the second movie my mom took me to see at the age of, I think, 7 or maybe 8. Now, this Billy Mitchell was a colonel in what was then the Army Air Force. And he was telling the American military above him and the people at the White House and the Pentagon that, you know, this attack was going to come. And it was going to come because he knew that the graduation exercise for the Japanese military was to plan an attack on Pearl Harbor. This is in the late 1920s we're talking about here, people. They damn well knew long in advance, even if they hadn't broken the Japanese code. And it makes perfectly good sense because what the Japs wanted to do was to take over Hawaii in order to establish an air base that they would be much closer to the United States and could attack the Pacific coast. So here again, another war we get into under false pretenses. It probably should not have happened. Now we get to the Vietnam quote-unquote war and the Gulf of Tonkin. And some of you may be historically familiar with a fellow named Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, which were published based on his work. And I didn't know until fairly recently, and I've got the CDs on this, the CD book, it's really good, that Ellsberg was in a position to be the first one in the war offices in Washington, D.C. to know of the alleged events in the Gulf of Tonkin where an American ship was apparently fired on by the Viet Cong. But he knew immediately that something was wrong with that. It just the way it came through wasn't right. I don't have all the details off the top of my head. But he knew, and was proven to be correct later, that nothing of the sort had happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. And yet this is the reason that his advisors gave good old LBJ, you know, to get him to declare the war in Vietnam, you know, to be a state of war to exist, and that's how we got into Vietnam and how we had over 55,000 American soldiers killed in a war, quote-unquote, we had no business being in. The same can be said for the war in Korea as well, where we got involved in a situation where we had absolutely no business being there, no constitutional provision to support being in a United Nations peacekeeping activity. It wasn't a war, people. Peacekeeping activity, and yet we're over there, and we lost a lot of lives over there in Korea as well. And you look at this, and you just have to wonder. And Vietnam, by the way, as I mentioned in an earlier video, to back up a sec, had been planned, and this is how these bastards do things on the Trilateral Commission and the New York Banksters. They're talking in the 1940s, by the way, about what the world was going to look like after World War II. I mean, this is long-term planning. Well, on the very day the armistice is signed by the Japanese, September 2nd, 1945. At the one and the same time, we were preparing over there to attack Japan militarily and have an invasion, which of course never happened after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But there's a lot of munitions over there and military gear and, you know, jeeps and what have you. And they had a fire sale over there, and apparently most of it was sold to a fellow that you might be familiar with, named Ho Chi Minh. That facilitated the war with the French that went on in the 1950s, with a successful conclusion when they ousted the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, and was the direct cause of our intervention in Vietnam 10 years later after the assassination of President Kennedy. If they don't have all these arms and goodies they got from us, and they did get a few from the Russians to be sure, none of that happens. And yet it was all planned from the very day World War II was being ended. They put this plan into motion. It worked beautifully from their work point of view. So you look at the history here of American involvement in wars, and you tell me which end is up here. And more importantly, this might explain nowadays why, with all this crap going on with ISIS allegedly blowing up in Paris and this, that, and the other, and Belgium being on high alert and who knows whatever, you're going to tell me that the current occupant of the White House couldn't pick up the telephone and place a call over there to Damascus, Syria, and say, knock it off. You don't cease and desist now, we're going to take care of your entire nation in the space of 24 hours. You don't think we could do that? And why shouldn't we, especially if we get grounds to declare war against Syria? If they come in there and do a 9/11 over here in America like they did 15 years ago. I mean, we could do that. Why don't we? Because we need enemies of this type to keep the military in power and to keep the states of emergency in existence. This government depends on it. They cannot function in a state of peace. It won't happen. It can't happen. They need this kind of crap. It's just going to continue until we're able to stop it one way or another. And that's what all my efforts are aimed at doing. That said, if you have any questions or comments about this or want to acquire some of the documents I have available that will help you do your own fighting with them in the courts, please contact me at my email address, ccaspari@live.com. That's ccaspari@live.com. Thank you.